Voilà. Bonjour tout le monde. J'espère que vous avez
Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you had a great weekend in your ridings across the country.
Committee on Industry and Technology. Nice to have everybody around the table this afternoon. As per an invitation we had made a little while back, we have joining us today la ministre Joly avec Monsieur Vincent du ministère.
Minister Joly with Mr. Vincent from the department.
Study we've been undertaking. Minister Joly and Monsieur Vincent will be here for the first hour, followed by the conclusion of witness testimony that we have for the final meeting of our EV study, which will follow this right after the first hour. With that, Madame la Ministre, la parole à vous, puis on va continuer.
Madam Minister, you have the floor. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to see you.
It's always been a nation of builders. For 158 years, our auto sector has done more than build cars. It has built communities, livelihoods, and dreams. And behind every vehicle rolling off our assembly lines are Canadian workers with extraordinary skills, with families whose futures are tied to good jobs, and towns that take pride in knowing the world relies on the quality of what we create. And today, that sector faces challenges. But for 158 years, Canada's auto sector has met every challenge with determination and heart. We have stood strong, protecting our people, supporting our families, and ensuring that our community thrives. And that is what makes us who we are, and make no mistake, we're fighting for Canadian workers. This is a defining moment for our country. The question before us is clear. How do we protect what we have built while positioning ourselves to lead in what comes next? And our answer is simple. We are building Canada by standing up for Canadian workers, investing in innovation, and ensuring that the vehicles of the future are designed, engineered, and built right here at home. We're not just preserving a legacy, we're strengthening it for generations to come. Nous croyons à l'ambition.
We believe in ambition. We believe that Canada can attract global investments to strengthen our industrial base and take the lead on the transition to a stronger and more competitive economy. And above all, we believe that Canada should not settle for reacting to change. It should help shape the change. That's why we launched the Canada's Auto Strategy in January of this year. A strategy which ensures that investments to strengthen supply chains and ensures that Canada remains a global leader in automobile manufacturing.
Strategy. In February, we announced $85 million for 122 projects to install more than 8,000 electric vehicles chargers across Canada through the Zero Emission Vehicle Infrastructure Program. In March, Premier Ford and I opened the Nexstar battery plant in Windsor, Ontario, a world-class facility that will create up to 2,500 good-paying jobs. In April, we announced $23 million investments to Siemens Canada to scale up its global AI manufacturing technologies research and development center for battery production right here in Oakville, in Canada. This investment will maintain 3,300 jobs in Canada and also create 90 new full-time jobs. And today, Parliamentary Secretary Rochefort has announced a $20 million investment in Electra Battery Materials Corporations to expand the production capacity in its existing refinery in Timiskaming Shores in Ontario to produce battery-grade cobalt sulfate. This facility will be North America's first cobalt sulfate refinery. It will deliver results under our auto strategy by strengthening Canada's critical mineral supply chain and advancing our leadership in electric vehicle battery production. It will create and maintain more than 160 jobs, including 60 full-time jobs for Canadians in Northern Ontario. And together, these investments demonstrate that our auto strategy is not only theory, it is creating real jobs in communities across the country. In this context, we must also be clear about the immediate challenges facing our workers and our communities, particularly those working for General Motors. Following GM's decision in October to end production in Ingersoll, this has created real uncertainty for auto workers and their families. Of course, we welcome GM's recent investment of $691 million in its St. Catharines propulsion plant. This is a positive step for Canada's auto sector. At the same time, our message has been clear. We want to see the Cami assembly in Ingersoll return to full production. We're working closely with the union, with the province, and industry partners to ensure a clear path forward to bring production back to Ingersoll. We remain confident in a positive resolution. In the meantime, we will preserve all available options, maintain a firm and principled approach, and continue to engage constructively. And as part of this process, we have initiated a 30-day period under the formal dispute resolution mechanism. L'industrie automobile.
The Canadian automobile industry is a cornerstone of our economy. It supports over 125,000 direct jobs, as well as hundreds of thousands others through the supply chain of large enterprises and SMEs. It contributes nearly $17 billion to our GDP.
Jobs here. Our government will be your strongest partner. But if you make promises and then walk away, you will be held accountable. It's about defending Canada's place as a leader in advanced auto manufacturing, not accepting a race to the bottom. Workers' livelihoods are not bargaining chips for corporate leverage or political games. These are real families with real paychecks and real communities that depend on them. Meanwhile, the process to protect auto workers in Brampton and hold Stellantis to account is underway. This is why we're working with the Government of Ontario and Unifor to defend all these jobs and hold Stellantis to account. To the auto workers across this country, we see you, we hear you, and we are with you. Monsieur le Président, je suis prête à répondre aux questions.
Mr. Chair, I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you very much, Madam Minister. We'll start with the first round of questions.
The floor is yours for 6 minutes.
Thank you for coming to committee, Minister Joly. You mentioned families, workers, the supports that we need to give them in order for our automotive industry to be successful in the future. This morning, you talked about loans and programs that would help people, businesses who are being impacted by the 232 tariffs. The last 2 weeks here in committee, we had many witnesses from my area, Windsor-Tecumseh Lakeshore, and others from across Ontario, some from Quebec, who talked about the problems that they're having with these tariffs and the impacts on their companies. Their testimony made it very, very clear that the only thing that could help them would be a tariff deal, a good tariff deal with the U.S. I have many quotes here if you'd like to hear them, but they testified, many of them testified that loans wouldn't help them, that the tariffs make them totally unprofitable. If they took the loans, they would just be delaying the problem because they wouldn't be able to pay them back. Can you see in the future any other supports that you can give them?
So thank you, Kathy, for your question. First and foremost, I agree with you that we need to fight for our workers. May they be auto workers, may they be steel workers, aluminum workers, or copper workers. They're all affected by tariffs. And indeed, we're engaging with the U.S. And we will work on having a good deal for Canadians, but we won't just accept any deal. And at the same time, what we believe is there are many things we can't control. We can't control what is going on in the White House, but we can control what we're doing here at home. And so that's why today we announced some new supports, $1.5 billion dollars worth of support. These are indeed loans for the $1 billion by the BDC, but they're interest-free for the first year and very, very low interest rates for year 2 and 3. And at the same time, throughout the 3-year period, only interest will have to be paid. And so it's actually a really good support for companies, and that's for bigger companies, because these loans will be between $2 million 5 million to 50 million. But at the same time, for the smaller companies, they have the regional development agencies, obviously in your region, FedDev, which is really important. And these loans include up to $1 million of non-repayable contribution, basically supporting even more smaller and medium-sized businesses. So we have to do both. We have to engage with the American administration, and at the same time, we have to work with our Canadian automakers to make sure that they also advance our own interests and Canada's interests in Washington. And at the same time, we need to be able to offer support to Canadian companies that need to be able to adapt and pivot.
Thank you, Minister. So up to $1 million in forgivable loans through FedDev?
And we can provide you all the information in order for you to relay that information also to your businesses.
Thank you. It's very new information, so it was hard to get all the details. Yeah. But if you looked at some of our medium-sized companies, our tool and mold, and let's remember that tool and mold is foundational to the auto industry. Some of our companies, which are considered medium-sized companies, would blow through that $1 million in forgivable loans in a month and a half to 2 months. So would you commit to making all of these loans forgivable as you did during the epidemic?
So actually, when you look at what the regional development agencies are proposing, it's actually a similar type of program. And the one that we're proposing for through the BDC is actually very, very favorable terms that was used during the 232 tariffs at the time of the first Trump administration. Mm-hmm. So this has been, and we'll adapt as events occur. But I think this was well received today. I've been receiving a lot of the Steel Association came out saying they were very favorable. Also, regional organizations in Ontario and Quebec as well. The Chamber of Commerce also of Ontario, and I had also different CEOs from small to bigger size businesses.
Thank you, Minister. I've also talked to many of the company owners in my area, and they really honestly don't feel that this is going to benefit them in the short run or the long run. So they're looking for some tariff relief, and they feel it's their only solution.
Well, we've got 15 seconds, Minister. I'll afford you the opportunity.
Yes, I think we can work together to explain you the different conditions. That way we can work together to make sure that they are also very well aware, because obviously we need to have the information flow. And I'm convinced that they will be convinced. And at the same time, we're also very open to different options and looking forward to working with you on that.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Borelli. Monsieur Natumba, la parole à vous, monsieur.
Mr. Natumba, you have the floor. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good afternoon, Minister. Madam Minister, the impact of American tariffs is being felt in Quebec and across Canada. The aluminum sector and other metals are at the heart of the regional economy, including in my riding. In this context, how can the plan announced today have concrete effects for the regions in Quebec in particular? And how does your department intend to collaborate with the government of Quebec to assess the economic situation in the most affected regions? Answer. When actions are taken by the White House, we react. So today's announcement follows up to a series of measures that were already in place. So we had already created counter tariffs of 25% on steel and aluminum. And we also tightened rules on steel importers who weren't following the rules. We already helped a number of companies through our regional economic development agencies, and we also already had a $5 billion fund to help companies. Now we are adding on to that today, $1.5 billion for affected sectors, steel, aluminum, copper. We are having a conversation for everything tied to forestry and softwood. All that to say that This money is deployed to a BDC for small and medium enterprises, but also for loans that are very favorable of $5 to $50 million. These are essentially interest-free loans for the first year, and in year 2 and 3, the interest is very low. And throughout the term, it's essentially, well, just the interest has to be paid. So in the first year, you have nothing to pay back. And then in the second and third year, very low interest rates. And at the end of the term, there is a repayment is necessary, but in 3 years, we'll be in another world. So we'll see how things look then. But we want to be able to offer companies the ability to predict their operations despite this constantly changing world. And at the same time, the regional economic development agencies will also have funding, particularly in your region. There will be I work with the DEC, and I'm happy to work with you, my colleague. Before I give the floor to my colleague, Sima, I'd like to know how are you spreading out this money across Canada, aside from metals companies? Well, we're working across the country, but the BDC, especially in the urban centers, that's why we're working with the regional economic development agencies like FedDev in Southern Ontario, the DEC in Quebec, ACOA in the Atlantic regions, Prairies Can and Pacific Can and Can Nord, all of the regional economic development agencies. And the distribution of sums will be announced shortly. Thank you.
And thank you very much for your ongoing support to our industries, including Siemens in Oakville. It was also great to see you this morning, where you announced a $1 billion loan program through BDC to steel, aluminum, and copper industries to support our businesses and the tariff disruptions. So as the member of the Ottawa Caucus, along with my colleague, MP O'Rourke, we had many opportunities to meet with the industry organizations, unions, and the major OEMs operating in Canada. And what I keep hearing is consistent. They are praising the direction that this government is going, and the repeal of the EV mandate, the return of the purchase incentives, and the investment signals. So they are pretty happy. My riding of Oakville West is home to significant number of auto workers for Ford, Oakville, and automotive suppliers who wake up every morning knowing that what happens at the federal level affect their families directly, so the stakes are high. Recently, GM announced $691 million for St. Catharines, on top of their actually recent investment for $50 million in Oshawa for stamping operations. Statistics Canada reported 47% surge in zero-emission vehicle sales in February alone. Toyota Honda continue to operate and invest in their operations. So, Minister, in a global environment of unprecedented trade pressure and uncertainty, how has this auto strategy managed to hold the confidence of an industry that has so much at stake, and what does its success tell us about where Canada is heading?
So I think there are two phenomena to understand when looking at the auto sector in Canada, but also affecting worldwide. First and foremost, it's really the impacts of tariffs. And in Canada, we're in a trade war. We have 25% tariffs against our auto sector. But because of the rules of origin, basically, the effective tariff is around 12.5%. So that's something that we have to be able to reckon. And the other thing is, there has been a lot of investments made across the world in electrification. Actually, capital is going towards electrification. And there's an entire industrial revolution happening in the auto sector. And for a long, long time, North America was leading these new technologies. And we need to make sure that that continues to be the case. And so that's why our auto strategy has two objectives. First, to support auto production in Canada, but second, also to make sure that we're able to double down on electrification and adopt these new technologies in order to make sure that the plant in your riding in Oakville, which is ongoing an important retooling, is developing the best cars in the world for the world. That we're able to see that in the Honda and Toyota, who just increased actually their production recently, and now they're more than 75% of all the auto production in Canada. The Premier Ford and I were there in Windsor in Mrs. Borelli's riding, opening a new battery plant facility, a Nexstar one. I was in Germany last week, or 2 weeks ago, meeting also with Volkswagen, who is opening an important plant in St. Thomas, which will create thousands of jobs. So we need to make sure that we do both. We defend our auto workers and we advocate for them in Washington, but at the same time, we need to be clear-eyed and we need to be able to, we're adopting new technologies that we're seeing across the world.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Ms. Lacan. Monsieur Saint-Marie, à vous pour 6 minutes.
Mr. Saint-Marie, you have the floor for 6 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Madam Minister, Mr. Deputy Minister, welcome. Two requests for the Deputy Minister, Mr. Vincent. If it's possible, can you please send us the total sums for updated battery streams by province? That would be appreciated. And second, concerning the order in council mentioned around the table, if you can give us the number of SMEs in what sector, in which province are affected by this 25% tariff. The study by the University of Calgary was used, and it targeted 55% of exports from Quebec that were targeted by that. And then on the weekend, Le Devoir published an article that said about a quarter of exports in Quebec are targeted. So if we could get the data on that, that would be very appreciated. If I can respond to that, we'll of course provide you with the numbers. But what I would say as well is that there have been different studies conducted within the government, and we are working also with Statistics Canada. So we will give you what we have for now, but we are still in the assessment of the impact of the tariffs, because it's based on the fact that the businesses affected self-identify. We will provide the numbers. As the minister said, it's important to have specific numbers, but we'll be certain that they're accurate. Thank you. A question concerning the impact of the tariffs. We conducted an emergency study on this, on SMEs, and the situations they are experiencing. Often the SMEs are not covered by the 50% tariffs on aluminum parts with the order that entered into effect on April 6th. It's on the entire value, and what that tells us is that at 25%, they're no longer able to export to the United States. And what they all told us, the SMEs and large companies, is that as an assistance measure cannot be a loan because they are already very much in debt after the pandemic and the inflation problems. There are great programs to improve productivity, but the SMEs had to take on debt to purchase new machines that entered into operation, and they did enter into operation, but they can't use them. They can't export to the United States anymore with these new machines. During QP, your colleague, Mr. Leblanc, said it doesn't close the door to this. If we need to do more, we'll do more. Do you share that opinion? Yes, absolutely. We were asked by various organizations, business organizations, chambers of commerce, so on and so forth, to relaunch the response to the tariff program. We broadened it to softwood lumber, forestry, and also to copper. Of course, that still covers aluminum and steel. In that program, we set out our non-reimbursable loans or subsidies for investment in machines for companies. And, companies, what we're trying to help them with is to diminish their dependence on the United States. And that's not an easy thing to do. I know that it's very difficult, and I know that it is a profound change to the business model of many companies, and it will come with risks, but our objective is to help them take on that risk, because we cannot find ourselves dependent on the American market anymore. We need to develop new markets. Our objective is to create a domestic national market through the various provinces as well to increase demand. And at the same time, for larger companies, the program that we are offering through the BDC is similar to the one offered during the pandemic. And so it is a program that was very appreciated at the time, and we are putting it forward because we think that it is the best way to help under the extraordinary circumstances we find ourselves in. For extraordinary circumstances, we require extraordinary measures. Thank you for that answer. Often SMEs export to the United States, and what concerns them is the time that it takes to find contracts in the domestic economy or other places. And so machinists, welders, there's a labor shortage. If they're not paid anymore, they seek work elsewhere and they don't come back. So yes, the program to modernize equipment is excellent for improving productivity, but the urgent thing is in very short term, in the coming weeks and months, just until July. And I'm afraid because I think that they won't make it that far because 60% of their business affairs have fallen off the ledger. I understand, and that's why with the BDC, it's liquidity that's being offered. It's money for businesses. Well, it's from $2 million to $50 million. You're right, but the business must have revenue of $5 million. So that's not a huge company either if it's a $5 million figure, but it has to be 20% of their revenue must be affected by the tariffs. So we'll look at how things are working. It's the first time we've gone as far as this. Softwood lumber didn't have the same conditions. We are ready to work to give it the same conditions, but you see that the government is taking a step forward in our business response because we know that there are cumulative events, the increased tariffs, new interpretations, and so on and so forth. We worked very hard to create predictability. It's a 3-year loan. For the first year, there's nothing to be reimbursed. After 3 years, there'll be different things happening in the U.S. We'll see what happens. But in the meantime, it helps buy time. But the businesses really need to be able to work to change their dependency on the United States because we can't just wait. Because if that's the case, I think that it's a strategy that's focused on nostalgia, and we cannot afford to rely on nostalgia. Thank you, Mr. Sainte-Marie.
The floor is yours for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Minister, for being with us today. In September 2024, when you were Foreign Affairs Minister, you imposed a 100% tariff on Chinese EVs. You called it an EV surtax order because, and I quote, increasing Chinese EV imports are expected to undermine the growth and development of the Canadian EV industry and other comparable vehicles. That's what you said in the Gazette. Then, of course, as you know, 15 months later, in January 2026, you struck a deal with China to allow 49,000 Chinese EVs into Canada at a much lower tariff rate. So really, I'm reading this and thinking that you've made a deal with China that directly undermines the Canadian auto industry. That's really in your own words, based on your assessment from September 2024. So I'm deeply concerned about this. I'm trying to figure out why you aren't.
Well, things happened since and the trade war started. And our North American market was disrupted by 25% tariffs. And so in these circumstances, what did we do? We made sure that we were able to get a good deal.
Ask a follow-up there.
I'll just finish.
I'm just not clear how important.
So, colleagues, I'm not
clear how.
This happened last time, so I'm gonna suggest we take the same route, which I think worked. I'm not going to hold the clock against you, Madame Dancho, to allow the minister to reply at a length similar to your question, and the same will be true the other way around. So we don't need to fight the clock here. The purpose is for us to have a thorough discussion. So, Minister, I'll give you about 20 seconds there to reply. And, Madame Dancho, I've pressed pause, and I won't resume the clock until the Minister is finished.
With China in order to make sure that our farmers, including in Mr. Falk and Ted's writing, would be able to continue to export their canola to China, and also our fishers in Atlantic Canada be able to export their produce to China in exchange of a small 2.6% quota of EVs coming from China. And that is similar to the 2023 contingent of cars.
Thank you, Minister. It's actually not small when you compare to how many EVs overall were sold in 2023. It's not small at all. In fact, it represents quite a large percentage of EVs sold in Canada before you put that tariff on them. But you mentioned again that bringing them in would put unwarranted downward pressure on pricing, challenging the profitability of Canadian producers, and reduce choice by crowding out other imports. So again, I'm just not clear how this is good for competition in Canada when you're importing a heavily subsidized car that we can't hope to compete with. How does this help our auto sector?
Well, you know, when you look at it, the cars that have been coming in are mainly Teslas, Polestars made by Volvo, Ford. So that's just a reality because the Western OEMs, so Western car makers, have also joint ventures and have been producing in China as well. And so that's the case across the world. We were able to limit that amount of cars in exchange of support to our farmers and fishers. And at the same time, we've made clear conditions that basically, I'll just finish my sentence, in order for Chinese car companies be able to do joint ventures with Canadian car companies here at home to basically build in Canada.
Again, a year and a half ago, you said in black and white that this was going to undermine our Canadian auto sector. And now here we are, you're bringing in almost 50,000 annually. But I also want to talk about how the Americans recently launched a Section 301 investigation into Canada and other countries over failure to enforce forced labor. I'm sure you're very familiar with the forced labor concerns. It was, in fact, your government that passed a law to stop forced labor. But of course, we've heard from testimony at this committee and others that aluminum, for example, is being used, is using forced labor from the Uyghurs. I'm quite concerned, as I know others are, that this could jeopardize our trade negotiation with the Americans. Are you concerned?
We have applicable laws regarding forced labor. We have an entire regulatory process. We have a private members bill that passed a couple of years ago that is applicable, and we'll follow it.
But again, it seems to be that Uyghurs are being forced. There's forced labor here that are making these automobiles that you're willing importing into Canada. And actually, that was one of the issues you cited 15 months ago of why you didn't want to do this. And I think I'll just quote Margaret McQuigg Johnston, who said that Canadians don't want to be driving cars made by slaves. Would you agree?
Of course.
Then why is it that you're allowing the imports of 49,000 cars that may in part be made by modern slave labor?
First and foremost, what we will do is when it comes to forced labors, we will address that through legislation, period. And my colleague that is in charge of public safety is in charge of the CBSA. And they need to do their job first. Second, when it comes to protecting our auto workers, because I think that's your point, our auto workers are protected in this deal because there are three conditions for any joint ventures with Chinese auto companies. First, labor standards. Second, making sure that we protect our localized supply chain. And at the same time, third, it's the entire security of the software. So we have an entire approach that is very holistic that will be protecting auto workers while bringing in really good technologies. And at the same time, what we want is affordability. I know that the Conservative Party, as the Liberal Party, as the Bloc Québécois, we're all in favor of affordability. These cars will be affordable.
Thank you. I hope you're right, because as you know, the Americans have threatened a 25% tariff on all goods if they find a country such as ours is importing with slave labor. No, I think when it comes to the Americans, dear colleague, we don't need to that these actions are going to allow it to get worse. But I'll go to my last question, if I may. Certainly regarding security concerns, I also know you're familiar with this. Electric vehicles, like other vehicles, are able to have a lot of our data, our GPS location. They sync with our phones. Are you comfortable with the Chinese government having access to that information from, say, yourself if you drove one of these?
Well, when it comes to also the security of software, my colleague Minister of Transport is working on a regulatory framework when it comes to protecting people's data in their cars. So I'll make sure that I'll work with him to improve that regulatory framework and also protect Canadians.
That need to be done
and
before
I think
we brought them
I
in,
just
though.
wanted to answer the question regarding the threats by the Americans to our auto workers. We won't accept them, and we won't be threatened, period.
It's not just our auto workers, it's all of our goods.
Thank you, Madame Dancho. Mr. Baines, the floor is yours for 5 minutes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Minister, for joining us today here and for all your hard work and navigating during this difficult time of the trade war. My question is around aluminum. As you know, it's very important to British Columbia, my home province, and manufacturing companies. It's a critical input for aerospace, shipbuilding, of course, the drone program that's going to be assembled in Richmond, British Columbia soon, coming up in the next month. Can you expand on how our new Buy Canada policy can support BC aluminum integration, not just for the major projects, but for critical sectors that I mentioned?
Thank you for that. I think we can be extremely proud of the work that is being done by aluminum workers in Kitimat in BC. The Rio Tinto infrastructure is iconic, and I must say is extremely important for the entire west coast of North America. And we've been working, and I've been in close touch with the CEO of Rio Tinto as he's in charge of the Kitimat and Saguenay-Lac-Saint-Jean investments. And as a Quebecer, I must say I'm, fond of aluminum products because it comes from my province, and I'm happy to know that also we share that in common between Quebec and BC. That being said, indeed, you're right. Our investments in defense will be helpful for the aerospace sector. When I was in your province, I went and went to Cascade, which is an important IMP-owned company that is a key for our country, and particularly Western Canada. And I went also to the De Havilland facility on Vancouver Island, which is quite something. And we're seeing that actually their book of business is going to be increased because of our investments. We need to land good investments in BC for the defense sector. And I'm convinced that by really increasing the demand for planes made in Canada, we will be able to support even more also our aluminum workers, because we know how much aluminum is key to the aerospace sector. So our Buy Canada policy, like you were mentioning, is going to be at work.
Thank you. And we are seeing some resilience. I know Stats Canada data showed Canada's GDP grew by 0.2% in Q1, led by the manufacturing sector, and it expanded to 1.8%, the largest gain since January 2023. So while we work towards a renewed CUSMA deal, and we had an announcement from today, if you could maybe talk a little bit about that, the support for Canadian manufacturers as they adapt and seek new markets.
Yeah, well, I think I've referred to that a bit earlier in my answers. It was a $1.5 billion announcement, $1 billion for the BDC, $500 for the regional development agencies. Obviously, in your part of the world, in BC, it's Prairie Scan. We will be announcing later this week the allocation for across the sector and across the country. And of course, Prairie Scan and Pacifican will get their fair share. And looking forward to working with my colleague Gregor Robertson, who's in charge of also Pacifican, and yourself, to make sure that we protect the aluminum workers in BC.
I'm just going to shift very quickly to a little bit about the EVs. In my city, we have the largest auto mall, and I've met with car dealers, and they're interested in knowing, having some stability in what they can sell, and they're really excited about the some of the announcements around the EVs. And 1 in 4 new cars sold worldwide are EVs, and British Columbia is probably one of the leaders in with
Absolutely.
EVs, as you know. So why is Canada well positioned to take advantage of this global trend?
Well, because we have the best auto workers in the world. You know, when you look at Honda and Toyota, their plants in Canada are at the same level of predictability as their plants in Japan. And so we can be proud of that. And because they've been extremely productive, actually, Honda and Toyota has decided to invest even more. And at this point, they've increased their production since the beginning of the trade war, and they're more than 75% of our entire auto production. So that's good. At the same time, also, we also believe that we need to invest even more in electrification. We know that we have to increase our grid. That's why we're working on also an electricity strategy. We know also that we need to have more charging stations across the country. We've been working with some players that are in the US and also in Europe to be able to make major investments here in Canada. When I say players, I mean private players, private companies. And of course, we've put in our auto strategy $1.5 billion through the Canada Infrastructure Bank to invest also in EV charging stations. So that's going to be good news also for people in BC that are very fond of EVs.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Thanks, Mr. Baines. Monsieur Saint-Marie, vous encore 2 minutes.
Mr. Saint-Marie, you have 2.5 minutes. Thank you. Concerning your announcements made this morning, it targets direct exporters. My question is for indirect exporters. During committee meetings, we had discussions, and often it's the service providers to companies that are hit by the 25% tariffs. If they export less, they purchase less from these suppliers. Are there assistant measures for these suppliers? If you don't have the answer now, that's okay, but you can follow up with us. And my second question is the BDC loan program. Is it accessible now? Because the program for the forestry sector was announced in August. All fall, we asked about it, and then it was only made available in December as an emergency fund. The minimum required for companies to have access to the financing will be 20% of their revenue. In the metals-related sector, so copper, steel, and aluminum, they need to have 20% of their revenue associated with that type of operation, and at the same time, the impact of the tariff must be 10%. So those are the two key factors. It's a two-step test. A second thing, what I would say is that we've learned from what happened in the fall. In the fall, we worked with the BDC. We did loan guarantees for banks, and the banks were the ones issuing loans. It was long. It was too long. It was arduous and frustrating. And the collaboration with the banking system is difficult. And that's why we decided to shake things up and work directly with the BDC because it's faster. And the government wanted to be able to offer assistance quickly. So these are not loan guarantees. These are interest-free loans that are very favorable, which will be deployed quickly. And also with the regional economic development agencies, because what saw in the fall was that the program was an irritant, whereas the regional development agencies are very popular, and that's why we redeployed it. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Saint-Marie.
The floor is yours for 5 minutes.
And thank you, Minister. It's always good to have you here at committee. I have a few fairly easy questions. Back in February, you indicated that the EV mandate had been paused and that it would be repealed. On what day will it be repealed?
On EV mandates?
Yes.
EV mandates, we said that we were not continuing them, and that's part of the auto strategy. So there's no EV mandates.
There is no EV mandate. Okay, thank you. Good. Then moving on here, at committee here we listened to Margaret McQuaig Johnson, and the question was put to her: it's illegal to import products into Canada made in whole or in part with forced labor, but the staff positions at ESDC and GAC related to forced labor are being wound up. Her response was, I would not trade off the torture and armed surveillance of Uyghurs in Xinjiang for marginal added number of cheap cars in Canada. I think it's therefore up to the government now to reassure Canadians that there will be no EVs entering Canada from China unless they are entirely free of components produced by forced labor. Minister, do you believe that there is forced labor in China?
Listen, that's a question that you should ask the Minister of Foreign Affairs. But at the same time, we've always been clear we would be working with the UN, and the UN Human Rights Commissioner has already stated in a report that there were concerns. So all that to say, what we're looking at actually are cars from China that are being produced by Tesla.
I asked about your opinion,
GM,
Minister.
By
Minister,
Ford,
you were the Minister of
by
Foreign
Volvo.
Affairs.
Yeah.
You're the Minister of Industry. Mm-hmm. Do you believe there is forced labor happening in China?
I've already stated my point of view on that. What I'm telling you now
what is your point of view?
And my point of view is we will always follow what the UN is saying, and the UN was unequivocal. Now, I'm not the Minister of...
You would agree that there is forced labor in China?
I'm not the Minister of Foreign Affairs anymore, and I'm convinced that Minister Anand can answer all your questions. What I can tell you, though, is that Canada will never accept any forms...
You'll be responsible
Canada will never accept
So,
any
Mr. Falk,
forced
if we
labor.
could just give the minister a couple of seconds to reply, and we'll go back
And so, since Canada will never accept any form of forced labor, we have a legislation that is about that, and we all voted in favor of it.
From a Liberal member?
From a Liberal member, and we're very proud of it, because we don't accept forced labor, period. So
do you
that is
believe that there's
why
forced
we
labor
will
in
make
China?
sure that the legislation applies, and meanwhile, we will work with those who want to export to Canada to make sure that they apply these conditions, period.
Okay, but Minister, you have been Minister of Foreign Affairs, you're Minister of Industry today. You say you agree with the UN position. And the UN position is that there is forced labor happening, especially among the Uyghur people in China. Are you saying that you would agree with that statement?
Listen, I agree with everything.
Yes or no?
Everything I've said in the past stands. So, now I'm before you as Minister of Industry. And as Minister of Industry, my job is to protect auto workers here. My job is internally focused, and everything that is linked to what is going on in China, my colleagues can answer.
Minister, I'm just asking
and I'm
you
very proud of all the record as Foreign Minister, and I'm very proud of all my record as Industry Minister. But we're in a trade war now, and we need to make sure that we protect our auto workers, and that's exactly what we're doing.
Minister,
and that's
I asked
why
you a simple question. Do you
following
believe there's
the auto
forced,
strategy,
do you
the
believe
support
there's a
from the
forced
sector
labor
was great.
practice happening in China?
I've answered your
That's a
question.
yes or no. It's just a yes or
you
no,
can
Minister.
continue to answer
I would like you to answer it, Minister.
to present your question. My answer will always be the same.
And your answer is what, yes or no?
Everything that I've said stands.
And you said yes?
And so I've answered your question.
Can you articulate it one more time? Because I'm very hard of understanding.
No, I'm convinced that you're very good at understanding, and you know exactly what I mean right now. But what I've said right now is that our auto strategy was following the deal we did with China, which was good in your writing also, because canola workers were finally able to get a deal.
I understand all about
and
my
they've been
farmers'
wanting
concerns.
that deal for a long, long time. So our relationship with China is multifaceted.
Margaret McClung Johnson testified before this committee that because they don't want anyone to know, Canadians' forced labor import ban is only as strong as our ability to verify compliance. Right after this government issued its first imports permits to China, Beijing passed a national security regulation explicitly prohibiting anyone in China from disclosing information about their supply chains. How are you certain that we will be able to determine whether or not these components in these Chinese manufactured EVs are not being sourced from factories that employ forced labor?
Here's what Scott Moe, which is Conservative Premier from Saskatchewan, said following the deal we did with China. Finally, relief for canola farmers. This was long overdue. And so we needed to make sure that we got to a deal. Is it perfect? We can always work on making it better, but fundamentally, Chinese EVs are across the world right now, including in our closest allies in Europe. They are. They present the biggest, the latest technology. They're very popular across the country. And meanwhile, we need to make sure that we offer Canadian choice, because I know the Conservative Party is in favor of choice. We're in favor of choice. At the same time, we need to be able to protect our auto production, and that's why the conditions for Chinese automakers to come to Canada are clear.
Okay, thanks very much, Mr. Falk. Madame O'Rourke, 5 minutes, and that will end the hour.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, Minister Joly, and Mr. Vincent. Welcome, and thank you very much for being here. I just want to ask a couple of quick questions about today's announcement, and then move to a broader approach on the auto strategy. So MP Borelli said that there was a feeling around the table that mold makers or others, that the only thing that would help them was a trade deal. But I'm curious, so Associated Press was reporting that on Friday, President Trump said he's going to increase the tariffs charged on cars and trucks from the EU, despite them having a trade deal. So again, does anyone have a safe trade deal? And why is Canada so insistent that we are going to get a good deal rather than any deal to ultimately help our auto sector and all of our manufacturers and every Canadian business?
So we're following very closely the different deals that were struck by the White House. And obviously the one with Japan, the one with Korea, which all were linked to the auto sector very much, the one with the EU as well, which was, again, very important for the EU. And at the same time, we followed what the U.S. Supreme Court said regarding the different tariffs. And we know that there will continue to be unpredictability. Now, the Prime Minister is engaged in negotiations with the U.S. We know that the auto sector is key to that deal. And meanwhile, what we're trying to do is to continue to have investments, notwithstanding the uncertainty. So when you look at the different investments that have been made since the beginning of the trade war, actually increased production by Honda and Toyota, which is 75% of our production at this point. The Next Star facility, 2,500 new jobs. A third shift that was also open in Stellantis in Mrs. Borelli's writing. A new investment announced last week by GM of $690 million. So these are good news, notwithstanding. Also, we're working with Ford to, as they're finalizing their retooling and biggest investments in Ford's history in Canada. So that's also good news. But you know what? We learn from history. When you look at what happened in the 80s, car plants were being shut down across the country. And it was mainly, at the time, the D3 that were closing and shutting down car plants in my home province and also in Ontario. And what we did, we brought in Japanese automakers. And we work. It was the Liberal government under Pierre Trudeau that did that, and eventually it was actually activated and put into place under the Conservative government of Brian Mulroney. And 40 years later, what do? Actually, we're inspired by what happened at the time. We diversify. We change our ways of doing things. We don't take anything for granted. And so being able to bring new players from Europe, but also from China here working with our auto parts companies, Linamar, Magna, and also Martin Ria, is something that we think can be actually inspired by what we did in the 80s. This is the ethos of our strategy. This is what we've been able to work with. And we just won't sit idle while there are decisions made south of the border that are affecting our auto workers. We'll fight for different ways of protecting their jobs, but also we'll make sure that we're attracting new investments.
Minister, I have less than a minute.
Yeah.
So, yes. So we all understand that many of these businesses are looking for tariff relief. The government, for the past year, has introduced a suite of tools for that tariff relief. And I'm just wondering if you want to walk us through those from the last year, really the range, from Strategic Response Fund to regional tariff to work share, should it come to that. But to really remind people of how the auto strategy consolidated that and how today's announcement actually adds to it to give the businesses some of that certainty that we're giving ourselves?
So, a couple of things. The entire steel sector in Canada, was dependent before the trade war to the automakers in Detroit. They were selling steel on the other side of the border, and that now is impossible because basically it's a tariff wall of 50% tariffs. And so what we've done is we work with them to be able to not only develop a domestic market, but also develop different type of steel. And we're working with Algoma, we're working with Dofasco, we're working with Orion in Saskatchewan. We're working on the steel front. And now, while we're helping them through the Strategic Response Fund of $5 billion, which you alluded to, what we're doing also, we're working with the supply chain, and that's why the regional development agencies are important. So meanwhile, while that is happening in the steel sector, we're working with the aluminum sector. The price of aluminum have just increased since the beginning of the trade war. So the profitability of the big players is actually very high. The thing is because of the uncertainty, they're not making the investments in their infrastructure. And so that's why we're providing CapEx money to support investments in the long run. Who is really affected is in Canada are the smaller players, part of the supply chain, because we don't have transformation capacity in this aluminum sector. We don't have a rolling mill a plant in Canada. It is a problem, and that is why we're working to support even more the small players in the supply chain on the aluminum side. Now, when you look at the auto sector is affected, of course, because obviously of the tariffs. We've made sure that through the Strategic Response Fund of $5 billion, we're helping Honda, we're helping Toyota, we're helping Ford. Meanwhile, GM and Stellantis took decisions in Ingersoll and Brampton that were contrary to their obligations. Either they'll bring production back or we'll get our money back. And meanwhile,
Minister, I'm going to ask you to wrap it in about 20 seconds.
Meanwhile,
we're getting over here.
Meanwhile, what we're doing with them is we're trying to attract more investments. And so we want the Germans to invest. We want the Koreans to invest. We want the Chinese to invest. But when they do so, they need the rules must be clear. They need to respect labor standards in Canada. They need to support our localized supply chain, so basically auto parts, and they need to buy them from here. And finally, they need to have a secure software. And so that is what we're doing in the country. And meanwhile, I must say, I'm working with the EU right now to align our industrial policies to be able to create a common market to ultimately defend our auto workers together and be able also to export more cars to the EU.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, colleagues, that brings us to the end of the first hour. Thank you very much to the Assistant Deputy Minister and the Minister for being here. I believe we're going to see you again at this committee in a couple of weeks' time to have a broader conversation about the estimates.
To my great pleasure.
But until then, colleagues, I'm going to gavel us back in right at 4:45, which is in about 6 minutes, because we have 4 witnesses in the next panel. It's going to take us a bit of time. Meeting suspended. Recommencer tout le monde.
So let's get started, everyone.
Last discussion we're going to have in relation to the EV study that we have been engaged with for a few months now. There are 4 witnesses joining us today. 3 of whom are joining us virtually, 1 here in the room. Witnesses, I typically allow a little bit of latitude on introductory remarks, but I'm going to have to be a little bit tighter on time today just because our first panel ran a fair bit over. So please, at 5 minutes, I'm not going to cut you off entirely, but I'm certainly going to tell you that we're close to that window there. So we have joining us here in the room someone we've heard from on several occasions. So welcome back to you, Brian Kingston, who's the President and Chief Executive Officer of the Canadian Vehicle Manufacturers Association. Thanks for making yourself available, sir. We've got from Dunsky Energy and Climate, Jeff Turner, who is the Director of Mobility, who's joining us virtually here today. We've got from Electro Federation Canada, Sheriff Sinasak, who's the Director of Standards and Government Affairs, and joining us as well virtually from Global Network for Strategic Effects, we have Michael Kovrig, who is the founder. So welcome to all of you. Thank you for being here today. Mr. Kovrig, I will start with you, sir. You'll have upwards of 5 minutes for introductory remarks. Oh, sorry, just before we begin, je peux confirmer qu'on a pris tous les tests.
I can confirm that all the tests were carried out and everyone passed. Thank you.
Mr. Kovrig, you are on mute, sir.
Thank you for the opportunity to advise the committee. Let's be clear, this is not the approach Canada wanted. The government was forced into it by American and Chinese trade barriers, and the challenge now is to make the best of a difficult situation regarding China's exports of electric vehicles to Canada. So in that context, I broadly support the government's defense, economic, industrial, and trade diversification strategies, and the intentions behind the Prime Minister's January arrangement in Beijing appear legitimate. But importing PRC electric vehicles will at best complicate and at worst endanger those strategies. So my remarks today focus on the implications of importing electric vehicles under a quota and build on my testimonies to the Committee on International Trade and Committee on Science and Research. China's Communist Party has decided manufacturing is the key to doubling economic output by 2035, deepening a second China shock that's already displacing industry in other countries. Its 15th five-year plan prioritizes building a modern industrial system with new energy vehicles, a designated emerging industry. The PRC would rather upgrade overcapacity than eliminate it, but it also depends on exports to grow, which gives Canada leverage. Further exposing Canada to China's distorted industrial gravity risks warping what remains of our advanced manufacturing. There is a trifecta of risks. First, structural dependence disrupts or co-opts key sectors such as automotive. Second, unfair competition erodes industrial capacity, technology, and employment. Third, systemic pressure compels Canada's government to respond with major industrial and protectionist policies. Batteries and electric vehicles are the thin end of the wedge. The 49,000 vehicles allowed in are less than the 3% of the Canadian light vehicle market, that's true, but 40% of 2025 battery electric vehicle sales. So state-supported Chinese electric vehicle companies sacrifice profit for market share and squeeze suppliers with price cuts and delayed payments. In Mexico, Chinese battery electric vehicles went from a quarter of the BEV market to nearly 90% in 2 years. Mexico ran the experiment, then reversed in January with a 50% tariff. Canada should not repeat that mistake. Once Chinese electric vehicles arrive, networks form around them: dealers, servicing, financing, software, and data. What begins as a capped quota becomes a ratchet that only expands. Concentrated sectoral economic dependence also constricts federal policymaking autonomy. The PRC weaponizes technology, supply chains, and market access to coerce independence to its geopolitical agenda. China's ambassador just demonstrated that when he pressed Canada to weaken long-standing policy on Taiwan. Importing Chinese EVs means importing predatory and monopolistic behavior that our companies can't survive, labor conditions our workers won't tolerate, and infringements of sovereignty our nation shouldn't accept. Our submission to Global Affairs Canada's consultation on the import quota recommends making it temporary, non-automatic, and reversible. The quota is a tool to safeguard economic security, not a scheme for cheaper cars. It should function as a ceiling to be maintained, not a target to be met, and expand only if it builds Canadian capacity and reduces Canadian vulnerability. balance it with faster access for EVs from trusted partners. 6 essential measures to manage the quota. First, publish a threshold and exit strategy before further allocation. Define acceptable exposure, what triggers suspension, and what happens if promised investment fails. Second, tighten eligibility. Before allocating quota share, screen for ownership, subsidies, forced labor, supply chain traceability, connected vehicle security, and risk of circumvention. Third, reward verified Canadian capability, not announcements, sales offices, or arrangements like the Stellantis Leap Motor proposal at Brampton, where Chinese kits would be assembled with little domestic content. 4, allocate annual allocation in quarterly tranches, no automatic increases. Count vehicles assembled from complete knockdown kits or in Chinese-controlled third country factories toward the quota. 5th, align with the United States on connected vehicle security. 6th, snap back. If Beijing renews coercion, the quota suspends automatically. That's risk management, not retaliation. In conclusion, arguments touting short-term consumer and environmental benefits are understandable, but the benefits of Chinese EVs are negated by broader harm to Canadian industry, employment, values, and independence. The real question is not, don't we want cheaper EVs? It's whether Canada wants to be a producer in the future auto economy or merely a consumer market for vehicles produced by China's industrial system. The decision window is now. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Mr. Kovrig. Ms. Sinisak, we'll turn to you now, upwards of 5 minutes.
Okay. Hi, thank you. My name is Shareth Sinisak. I'm the Director of Government Affairs at Electro Federation Canada, and EFC is a not-for-profit industry association representing the full electrical supply chain. Canada needs a strong, long-term EV charging infrastructure strategy, one that invests in public charging infrastructure and charging for multi-unit residential buildings, but also a strategy that goes beyond deployment and ensures that residential chargers, vehicles, and electrical grid all work together seamlessly. First, let's discuss the need for public charging. Programs like the Zero Emission Vehicle Infrastructure Program have helped build early momentum for public charging infrastructure, but the momentum must continue. Capitalizing ZEVEP to sustain private investment is essential. At the same time, expanding the Clean Technology Investment Tax Credit to include on-road EV charging would unlock faster deployment of public and fleet infrastructure. Second, we need to ensure that EV readiness is included in our building codes. Installing EV infrastructure during construction is 3 to 4 times more cost-effective than retrofitting later. For those living in multi-unit residential buildings, this is the biggest barrier, and the cost of retrofitting is preventing access to home charging. The federal government needs to act on 2 fronts. Develop a national strategy to retrofit multi-unit residential buildings, supported by targeted incentives, and stop the problem from getting worse by ensuring all multi-unit residentials are constructed EV-ready. Third, a national strategy must go beyond residential deployment targets. It must have consistent technical specifications to ensure chargers, vehicles, and the grid are all working together. EVs are seen as a source of electricity consumption, but I want you to rethink EVs as a national battery storage infrastructure. EVs and their battery storage have the potential to be a national energy asset for our grid. And a recent report by CSA Group called Charging Ahead, Unlocking Vehicle-to-Grid Integration, outlines the scope of this opportunity. With vehicle-to-building communications, EV batteries can power critical equipment in your home during a blackout. That could include medical equipment. EVs could reduce strain on the grid or dependency during high-cost times of use, saving Canadians money. With vehicle-to-grid integration, EVs could reduce demand on the grid during peak times or return power to the grid or your home, reducing system reliance on costly peaker plants. At scale, even small contributions from millions of batteries and vehicles can stabilize the grid to help prevent an outage. But without alignment, chargers may not communicate with vehicles may not integrate with buildings or the grid, and residential EVs and charging investments risk becoming fragmented and, frankly, underutilized. Canada needs dedicated resources to convene industry, utilities, regulators, and provincial stakeholders to develop and detail a technical framework, specifications, and the regulatory constructs to make vehicle-to-grid work at scale. Secondly, this group needs to identify code amendments in the National Energy Code and Building Code, and Canada currently lacks a nationally coordinated form for this work. And this work is urgent. From a manufacturer's perspective, we need certainty, we need direction, and then we need time. So to conclude, Canada needs a strong long-term EV charging infrastructure strategy, but a strategy that invests in public charging infrastructure and access to charging in multi-unit residential buildings. A national EV strategy must ensure chargers, vehicles, and the electrical grid are working together seamlessly to unlock an integrated energy future that all Canadians will benefit from. Thank you. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Ms. Sinisak. Okay, Mr. Turner, we'll turn to you. 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. My name is Jeff Turner. I'm the Director of Mobility at Dunsky Energy and Climate Advisors. I'll begin by providing a bit of background on my own professional experience, followed by an overview of the type of work that Dunsky does in the EV space, and some specific findings from recent projects as they relate to federal EV policies. My career has been focused on transportation electrification for almost 20 years. I have degrees in mechanical engineering from McGill University, where my research involved designing prototype hybrid and electric vehicles and modeling battery performance in cold climates. I've worked for 2 different hybrid and electric vehicle manufacturers, and I spent 4 years at BC Hydro's PowerTech Labs, where I focused on technologies that help integrate EVs into the grid and deploying public charging infrastructure. In 2017, I joined Dunsky, a Canadian firm with over 70 professionals focused on analysis and strategy development to support the energy transition. Since then, we've conducted projects with governments, utilities, and corporations in all 10 provinces, helping them to understand and design policies to overcome barriers to adoption of EVs, anticipate the pace of adoption and associated demand on the grid, and develop policies for effective deployment of charging infrastructure. We've developed load forecasts for 15 Canadian electric utilities across 8 provinces, as well as EV analysis and strategies for 22 Canadian cities, from Halifax to Victoria, Toronto to Calgary, and many in between. Not to mention our work with provincial governments of all stripes, including BC, Manitoba, Ontario, Quebec, New Brunswick, PEI, and Nova Scotia. Through these projects, we gain a deep understanding of how EVs work in these regions, what specific barriers are holding consumers back, and how these barriers are evolving over time. This has given us the chance to continually refine our analysis, and in particular, our EV adoption forecasting model, which we first launched in 2018. Last year, we had the opportunity to put this model to use, developing forecasts for EV adoption in each province and territory as part of the Powering Up project with Electric Mobility Canada. We forecasted EV adoption under a range of policy scenarios and quantified the associated electrical load growth in each region. This analysis found that EVs can bring significant benefits to Canadians, including almost $2,000 per year in fuel savings per household, and reductions of GHG emissions and other emissions that have significant health impacts for Canadians. The technology progress we're seeing with EVs is global in nature, so our forecasts predict a significant trend towards EVs across all scenarios, but the right policy mix can bring these benefits to more Canadians sooner. This February, the federal government announced a new automotive strategy that included tailpipe emission standards, reduced tariffs on imported EVs, and a temporary return of purchase rebates with a clear plan for a gradual phase-out over the next 5 years. We've since had the chance to support our clients in updating our forecasts in response to these announcements, and our initial findings suggest that Canada's EV market is about to see a significant rebound. We've seen a lot of discussion and headlines over the past year fixated on the significant drop in EV sales in 2025. Our modeling saw this as a very predictable outcome of the pause in federal rebates and ensuing uncertainty. With the launch of the EV affordability program, including a gradual reduction in rebate levels over time as EV purchase prices continue to decline, we see a clear path towards the Prime Minister's stated target of 75% market share by 2035. That said, we know there's still important work to do to support this transition. The build-out of public charging infrastructure will require ongoing investment for years to come as more EVs hit the road. We need to scale up our efforts to enable more Canadians to access charging at home, including retrofits of multi-unit residential buildings, while updating codes and standards will ensure new buildings are built with EVs in mind and avoid the cost of retrofits in the future. Electric utilities need to continue planning for load growth from EVs while ramping up policies and programs that can turn EVs into valuable flexibility assets for the grid through vehicle grid integration. The federal government can play an important role in coordinating and supporting these efforts across the country while providing policy certainty that can help mobilize investments from other levels of government, utilities, and the private sector. I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Turner. Mr. Kingston, the floor is yours for upwards of 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Committee members, appreciate the invite to be here today. The Canadian Vehicle Manufacturers Association is the industry association that represents Canada's leading manufacturers of light and heavy-duty motor vehicles. Membership includes Ford, General Motors, and Stellantis. CVMA members have been operating in Canada for over 100 years. They're responsible for most auto production, having built over 100 million vehicles since 1945. Today, they are the largest employers, investors, and innovators in Canada. Ford, General Motors, and Stellantis are at the forefront of the transformation to electrification. General Motors and Ford are the top sellers of electric vehicles, while Stellantis is the only manufacturer that is building plug-in hybrids and EVs right here in Canada today. So given the leading role that CVMA members play in electrification, their success in Canada is fundamental to the government's EV ambitions. Addressing the immediate challenges facing auto manufacturers will ensure that Canada has a role in the emerging North American EV supply chain. So with that, I'm going to recommend the following actions to support EV adoption and secure Canada's role in the automotive supply chain. Number one is to bolster demand for EVs and EV adoption. We welcome the federal government's renewal of EV purchase incentives and the commitment to developing a robust charging infrastructure network. The CVMA members are well positioned to support the shift to electrification through their diverse product offerings. But as we just heard from the previous witness, there's much work to do on the infrastructure side. The charging gap in Canada continues to grow. There's 39,000 charging ports in Canada as of yesterday. That's public charging ports of a required 450,000. So to meet the government's 75% EV sales target, we need a credible charging strategy. Number two, secure access to the U.S. market. With over 90% of Canadian production destined for the U.S., there is no industry without U.S. access and North American integration. Diversification is not an option. Markets in Europe and Asia are better served by assembly plants in those regions. Our market alone is too small to justify large-scale manufacturing. The future of our industry, our ability to play a role in electrification, depends on securing the trade relationship with the United States. That means the removal of Section 232 tariffs and the renewal of CUSMA. Number three, eliminate the Canada-China strategic partnership. The agreement negotiated with China to allow 49,000 EVs into Canada, equivalent to about 1/3 of the total number of EVs sold in this country, will undermine the auto sector and presents risks to the North American auto supply chain. China does not adhere to the rules-based trade and investment principles that have been fundamental to the success of the auto industry and the broader Canadian economy. There are no guardrails in this agreement to ensure a level playing field for manufacturers that have invested in Canada or to protect Canadians from cybersecurity risks. And fourth, make Canada more competitive. Canadian auto manufacturers are currently navigating an unprecedented period of volatility. Tariff costs through 2025 reached approximately $5 billion, eroding the competitiveness of domestic production and making Canada an increasingly difficult environment for investment. So we should strive to make Canada one of the most competitive jurisdictions in the world for automotive investment. This means reducing the regulatory burden on companies and lowering the cost of investing in plants, machinery, and R&D. For example, the costly and redundant EV mandate remains in place today. That's 3 months after the Prime Minister announced that it would be repealed. While urgency is required to remove the EV mandate, the opposite holds true for the development of Canada's sovereign GHG regulations. Rushing the development of Canada-unique regulations creates serious risks for Canada. It will create market distortions and will produce a fundamentally flawed policy. CVMA members are ready to work collaboratively with government to develop thoughtful, well-designed regulations that reflect market realities while advancing Canada's climate objectives. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Kingston. All right, colleagues, we'll enter into our first round of questions. Mr. Guglielmin, the floor is yours for 6 minutes, sir.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for your opening testimony. Mr. Kingston, welcome back to the Industry Committee. I'm going to start with you because you just said the EV mandate's not repealed. In the previous hour, we heard from the Minister of Industry who was asked that question and informed us that the EV mandate is actually repealed. So what's the disconnect?
The mandate is still in force today, and it continues to create financial and legal compliance burdens for companies.
Thank you. Mr. Korvik, thank you for being here. And I want to acknowledge at the onset that you spent 1,019 days detained by the People's Republic of China. So you understand the threat of the PRC firsthand. And I believe that truly that Canadians owe you a debt of gratitude for the clarity that you've brought to this issue since then. Now, you've testified at other committees and in interviews, and you've written publicly that deepening economic entanglement with China is not a long-term route. It's a dead end. I think it's critical that Canadians understand what workers and the Canadian auto supply chain is facing right now. Now, I know you've looked closely at Europe in the past and their experience letting BYD and other Chinese EV makers into the market. In the previous hour, we heard from the Minister of Industry that many Europeans are letting Chinese EVs into their market, and in fact, it's a good thing. But you've said it's led to, and I'm quoting you here, long-term structural industrial decline. Now, Canada has roughly 125,000 auto jobs, many of them concentrated in Ontario. So if the government doesn't get Chinese EV policy right, what does the European example tell us that could potentially happen to our workers and our plants and our communities in the long run?
Thank you very much, first of all, for your very kind remarks. I deeply appreciate them. Look, let me give you some numbers looking at comparative markets, including Europe, right? From 22 to 2025, Chinese-built battery electric vehicles went from near zero to dominant share in Indonesia, 93%, Mexico, from 28% to 90% in 2 years, Brazil, 85%, Israel, 81%, Australia to 78%. In Europe, we've likewise seen tariffs being inadequate to actually constrain that increase. We've seen huge increases just over the last year of electric vehicle sales. And it's not merely electric vehicles produced by Western brands at joint venture factories in China, such as Tesla, but Chinese brand EVs made in China that have secured a dominant position in major global markets. And because they can't enter the United States, they are being deflected in many respects to Europe, which is a major purchase market for them. That has huge ramifications for European production, which we could get into in more detail if you like. So the quota alone doesn't solve the dependency problem. It manages volume, but not the structural dependency created through Chinese origin software, dealer networks, brand loyalty, and political constituencies that resist future restrictions. Right? Tariffs are the only tool that has reliably worked. The EU put definitive countervailing duties on BYD 17%, Geely 18.8%, on SAIC 35%, on top of the standard 10% MFM duty as of October 2024. Even so, Chinese automakers now hold 5 to 6% of the total European car market, rising fast through electric vehicles. Rhodium Group, for example, estimates that duties of 40 to 50% would be required to materially shift the trajectory. Otherwise, what you are going to see is the hollowing out of Europe's industrial base. The UK offers a cautionary tale, not a model. It has no tariffs. BYD
I'm going to
sold
interrupt
Tesla
you
there. So,
for a second.
Sure, please, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt. So basically, they gain access to the market. They increase their they're able to increase their quotas over time. And then, as you mentioned in your opening remarks, what they tend to do is use their market access for geopolitical leverage. Now, you appeared recently on Power and Politics, and you were talking in the context of forced labor and how Canada has a commitment to block components of vehicles that are built by forced labor, but we've only really blocked 2 shipments under the import ban since it came into force, the forced labor import ban in 2020, compared to thousands blocked by the United States. Now, witnesses have testified before this committee saying that many components of Chinese EVs contain aluminum that's processed by Uyghur forced labor in Xinjiang. And a fact that the government itself acknowledged in 2024. It had a surtax order that implied, and it cited concerning labor practice, including forced labor, as a driver of artificially low Chinese EV prices. So I'm just wondering, in your assessment, can Canada credibly assure that no Chinese EV vehicles are entering the country that haven't had components produced by forced labor?
Not currently, no.
And then I would say just recently, China passed a national security regulation explicitly prohibiting any Chinese company from reporting information about their supply chains. So if we rely, and we heard the minister say in the last hour that we're going to rely on CBSA for enforcement, but if they're no longer reporting it, we have to just rely on their word. And I was just wondering, in your opinion, if their word would be credible.
Not even remotely. Look, a few years ago, for example, due diligence companies, right? Because corporations that are sourcing anything from China need to be able to ensure their supply chains are meeting their own due diligence and corporate social responsibility standards. Due diligence companies, including Mintz Group, for example, have had their Chinese staff arbitrarily detained, and they've been put under severe pressure simply for suggesting that they might get involved in that kind of due diligence inspection in Xinjiang and other sensitive areas in China. Forced labor is built directly into the EV supply chain, and the evidence base is substantial. Sheffield Hallam University's report documents Uyghur labor transfers feeding automotive supply chains used by every major Western and Chinese OEM. The U.S. Department of Labor has confirmed and incorporated those findings into enforcement. 6 UN special rapporteurs warned in 2023 that state-directed labor transfers in Tibet, where the lithium in BYD and cattle battery cells is predominantly sourced, may constitute forced labor. There are also examples from Brazil and Hungary recently of labor conditions that were described as analogous to slavery being used by contractors in those countries, just to give you a few examples. So Canada would not be maintaining our own labor standards if we are bringing these companies in. It would be importing suppliers-based standards. That's the fundamental problem, unless you have a much more effective regime and prohibition on goods.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Guglielmin. Mr. Bardizzi, the floor is yours for 6 minutes.
Thank you very much. Mr. Kovrig, I want to thank you for some of the specific advice you gave in your opening statement, and I'll note you mentioned Stellantis, and I'll note that Minister Joly rolled out the use of that plant for knockdown kits in Brampton. And you also, I think, spoke to the larger set of policy objectives that an EV policy should have. So I just want to ask some of the witnesses about that in a bit more depth, starting with Ms. Sinasek.
Sinasek, that's right, yes.
Sorry, Ms. Sinasek. Can you just speak to the demand that you're hearing about for electric vehicle connectivity in urban areas, which is informing your very strong perspective on an electric vehicle charging infrastructure plan, having that focused on multi-use residential buildings?
I don't know if I'm going to answer your question directly here, but we see it as it's a major barrier. So, as electrical industry, when we go to, maybe a customer is asking us to install an EV charger, one of the major barriers that we keep on seeing is the actual electrical infrastructure itself. And this problem is absolutely massive, and it's not going to solve itself without some government intervention, especially on the retro. So we have existing buildings, multi-unit residential buildings that need to be retrofitted. But what we really need to stop doing is building multi-unit residential buildings that are not EV ready, because that's continuing to make that problem bigger. And we're locking out a large proportion of Canadians from accessing EV charging at home.
Are there Canadian companies that are well positioned to do this servicing and hookup?
Oh, yes. So the electrical supply chain here in Canada is robust. We are highly integrated with the U.S., but definitely those services are here in Canada, as well as the electrical contractors who EFC does not represent, but we obviously work closely with them, and there's electrical contractors here in Canada to do that work.
I wanted to ask Mr. Kingston about the role of EV rebates. You mentioned that in your statement. What are you hearing? I know you have a relationship with dealers. What are you hearing from dealers and the Home Office about what the rebates create opportunities for?
Yeah, demand for EVs is directly related to rebates, and we saw it when the previous federal government rebate went away. We saw demand for EVs decline quite significantly. Same thing at the provincial level. With the introduction of the EVAP program, there's been an immediate renewed interest in electric vehicles. So this is fundamental. If we want more people to switch to EVs, you have to incentivize it in the early years.
Is it necessary, in your view, that those rebates only be available to cars that are manufactured in Canada?
No, we support the EV rebate being broadly applied with the exception of China, which I'm happy to get into, because the fact is we don't build a full suite of electric vehicles in Canada. The only company that's building EVs is Stellantis, so if you were to limit it purely to Canadian production, that would be helpful to the production that's occurring here, but we just simply wouldn't see enough uptake to drive demand.
Thank you very much. A couple of questions for Mr. Turner. Mr. Turner, you mentioned the role of tailpipe emissions as a policy that drives innovation, but also drives greenhouse gas emission reductions. Could you just speak more to your observation around that choice, that policy instrument choice of more stringent tailpipe emission standards?
Sure. Yeah. So I think the context here is that, of course, the previous policy, the EV availability standard, specified a market share of sales of specifically EVs, battery electric vehicles, and plug-in hybrids that would increase over time. The shift to a GHG standard responds to requests for more flexibility in terms of achieving emissions reductions. And so in the near term, what that does is that opens the door to non-plug-in hybrid vehicles that are still powered by fossil fuels, but that offer significant reductions in overall fuel consumption. So that policy does create that flexibility. And the only question really is, in the long term, how stringent do the targets become? Because after a certain point, you really do need to shift towards plug-in vehicles to attain more significant emissions reductions.
We know that the U.S. administration has recently abandoned tailpipe emission standards, but can you speak to other jurisdictions that have them and their effectiveness?
Yes, I mean, we've seen a significant push for emissions reductions in Europe. There's obviously a lot of debate over the timelines, as we've seen here as well. But I think, as we've seen in other markets, I mean, at this point, EVs represent about 1/4 of new vehicle sales around the world. That's a reflection of policy issues like emissions targets, but also just the significant technology progress as well. So I think at this point, it's frustrating for me as a Canadian to see us behind the global average, but I'm excited for this new policy to be defined over the coming years, along with the other supportive measures as well, to really push towards those longer-term targets.
And could you just speak either broadly or specifically about how EV-friendly policies incent economic activity over a broader range of geographic areas rather than just in the manufacturing space?
Absolutely. I mean, I think charging infrastructure is obviously a key ingredient. Most people do most of their charging at home if they have a driveway. There, right away, we have work for electricians to upgrade homes to be able to enable that charging infrastructure. But I think most people right away, they think about, what's the equivalent of a gas station? We need public charging infrastructure to enable longer trips. And that's a significant investment that we need to make across the country, not concentrated in just one region for manufacturing, but in every region across the country. We need electrical contractors, civil contractors, and the companies that are actually producing this charging infrastructure as well.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bardisi. Monsieur Saint-Marie, 6 minutes.
Mr. Saint-Marie, 6 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chair. My first question is for Mr. Kingston, but before that I will take a moment to greet all of the witnesses. Once again, we have a lot of content today. Thank you for joining us. And I would also particularly like to greet Mr. Kovrig. I can say that for the years of your detention in China, we were following every update in Quebec, and we were very concerned for you about your detention in horrible conditions with Kafkaesque charges. So we are very happy that you are out of those conditions. It's very moving to see you and to say that to you face to face on behalf of my colleagues and fellow Quebecers. Then back to the committee's work. Mr. Kingston, you were here in the room during the first hour when the minister was speaking. I would like to know, yes, for all EVs, but for all vehicles, do you have comments about what you heard from the minister and the discussions that you overheard in the first hour concerning the auto industry?
Any specific element or just more broadly?
De façon générale, oui.
Just broadly speaking.
Well, I would say with respect to the whole concept that Canada is going to attract Chinese joint ventures, that is not feasible. That's not realistic. It's not going to happen. That's not how Chinese OEMs operate. If you look at any of the JVs that they've done in other markets around the world, it's with knockdown kits. That's what they do. And if they build a plant, they bring in labor from China. And as we've seen in Hungary, the conditions have been characterized as slave-like conditions. So this whole concept around creating JVs, attracting Chinese investment, that is really missing the point. We need to focus on protecting what we have, which is an industry that is totally integrated with the United States. That is never going to change. So our priority must be on working with the Americans, not opening the market to China.
Okay. Merci. La ministre aussi.
Thank you. The minister also referred at the end of her appearance to a possible partnership with the EU, perhaps for EVs, and developing a shared market. Is there any interesting potential there, or would it really be more focused on the American market?
No, there's no world in which we're going to create an industry that exports large volumes to Europe. We've seen in the past some manufacturers will send small volumes of particular cars to the EU, but if you're going to service Europe, you'll do it from Europe or somewhere close by. This industry has been created over 60 years on a North American supply chain, and we just happen to sit beside the largest, most dynamic, wealthiest economy in the world. And so the gravity model of trade dictates that you're going to do the overwhelming share of your trade with the largest economy in closest proximity. Not only that, but the European Union is not what I would characterize as a high growth market. I was just there a couple of weeks ago, and there's a lot of hand-wringing about the future of Europe and demographic challenges, weak economic growth. Our future lies in working with the American economy, and that's where we have to focus our efforts.
Merci beaucoup pour vos réponses.
Thank you very much for your responses. My next question is for Ms. Sinisak. I found what you were proposing to be very interesting. So integrating and how car batteries can be an asset that can help feed the broader grid and help during electrical outages. To your knowledge, are there places where that already exists, or are we still at the proposal stage?
Yeah. Okay. So there are EV adoptions around the globe. So the Netherlands obviously is the top European leader with widespread vehicle-to-grid capabilities and charging infrastructure. Germany also has entered a commercial vehicle-to-grid phase in 2026 with a new framework that they have removing regulatory barriers. And you'll see Mercedes-Benz is now releasing a vehicle-to-grid ready mass market car. And look no further than the U.S. and California, where they are currently piloting projects there.
Okay, merci beaucoup. Et puis,
Thank you very much. And I would have liked to ask you what is missing for us to start doing that in regions across Canada. But my colleague, you already mentioned. So I will direct my questions to Mr. Turner concerning this integration of electric batteries in a region like Quebec. Do you have any comments about that on the project? Yes, certainly. Thank you. I will respond in English.
This is a new area. It's an exciting area for Canada, but we do have some exciting progress in different parts of the country. Nova Scotia Power conducted a bidirectional charging pilot a few years ago. BC Hydro just last year demonstrated a bus that was providing power back to the grid. So this is an important emerging area that's showing a lot of promise. The utilities that we work with across the country are paying a lot of attention to this and see EVs as an overall net benefit to the grid. The increased demand during off-peak times when there's spare capacity, that increases revenue for the electric utility to help pay for all the fixed costs. And our analysis suggests that thanks to that and with careful management of EV load growth, they can actually drive electricity costs down for all consumers. So there are important steps to be taken. We're helping to coordinate a nationwide effort to seek coordination on vehicle grid integration across the country. And we'll be tackling such issues as the communication standards that are required to support this, cybersecurity issues, and how to also just make the business case for these types of programs and policies.
Merci beaucoup.
Merci, Monsieur Sim.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Sainte-Marie.
Quite significantly over time, what we're going to do is I'm going to afford Madame Dancho 5 minutes, Mr. Natumba and Madame O'Rourke are going to have 2.5 minutes each. I'm going to give you a final brief question, Monsieur Sainte-Marie. 5 minutes, c'est pas bref pour vous, monsieur, mais peut-être 30 secondes.
5 minutes isn't brief for you, sir, but...
The floor is yours, Madame Dancho, for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you very much to the witnesses being here. I appreciate the testimony. My questions are some of them are for Mr. Kingston. I want to talk a little bit about the potential long-term impacts of allowing more Chinese EVs into Canada. I think about it a bit of how, 35 years ago, we blew open the North American market to cheap goods from China. Now, anything you turn over in this room is probably made in China. I'm concerned that 30 years from now, there may not be any North American auto manufacturers if we start letting Chinese EVs in, because we really just can't compete with how with how cheap they can make their cars. Just any thoughts? Am I off the mark? Are you concerned about this?
Yes, I'm deeply concerned. So China subsidizes their industry massively. I mean, the estimate is about $230 billion US, which eclipses anything that we've seen in North America. Of course, they have depressed wages. There's no organized labor unions at Chinese auto plants, so they're paying on average $2 US an hour. A Canadian plant, Unifor unionized, is $45 an hour. They have massive overcapacity. They've got enough capacity in China to satisfy domestic demand 2 or 3 times over. So what they're doing now is trying to dump this excess product into markets around the world that are naive enough to open up and accept said product. So we know where this goes. You just look at markets that have opened to China. China is a coercive trade partner. Once the door is open, they will seek additional market access until your industry is eliminated, and then you become totally dependent on them for said product. That is the road we're going down with this agreement.
Thank you very much. I think that really sums up a lot of the concern that we've heard from a lot of other witnesses. And then when you add in the security implications of some of this, and of course we know all vehicles, new vehicles today are quite electric, have a lot of electronic systems. They're almost like smartphones on wheels, whether they're EVs or not. So my understanding is all the auto companies have a lot of the data that we have, whether it's GPS, we sync our phones with them, but you represent, of course, a major North American auto manufacturers. From what you know of what your companies have data-wise, are you comfortable with China having access to that data at a big scale in Canada?
No, absolutely not. And the cyber risks have been well documented. I mean, other countries that have allowed Chinese EVs into the market, Israel, Poland, and the UK, have now put bans in place on the operation of these vehicles around government facilities or military facilities. Even China has put bans on American-owned Teslas driving in China. So if China is doing that, it must be because they believe that there is a cyber risk. The idea that we would allow these vehicles to drive on our roads without any sort of conditions or guardrails around what is done with the data and where it goes is deeply concerning. And just to be clear on this point, the government did commit in 2024 to put in place rules with respect to connected vehicle hardware and software to align with the United States. That has not happened, and this agreement has already been struck.
Now, Mr. Kovrig, would you mind answering the same question? Do you have similar concerns to Mr. Kingston?
Yes, absolutely. Chinese EVs are connected state-linked data platforms. A modern Chinese EV is a rolling computer with cameras, microphones, and so on. And yes, all modern autonomous vehicles or EVs can do that, but China's 2017 national intelligence law compels any Chinese firm, including from overseas operations, to share data with Beijing on demand. There's no judicial review and no challenge mechanism. The U.S. Department of Homeland Security has been blunt. PRC firms have limited to no recourse. That's why the U.S. Bureau of Industry and Security calls connected vehicles an undue and unacceptable risk, and why the Five Eyes have already restricted Huawei, TikTok, Hikvision, and DJI on the same logic. Connected vehicles are next on that list.
Thank you very much. And when you were answering some questions to my colleague Michael Gugelmin earlier, you were going to talk about the impact that Chinese EVs has had on the UK. I just want to give you an opportunity to finish what your thought was on there.
Sure. I mean, essentially, the UK is again not a particularly effective model for Canada, right? Because it has opened its market entirely, and the result has been that the Chinese vehicles have made rapid gains in that market. But the UK is in a critically different position. It doesn't try to have the same sort of scale of domestic auto industry. And from a connected vehicle perspective, again, it's an illustrative model that Canada wants to be careful with. The problem, similarly to the Huawei problem, right, is a lot of these countries initially let in Huawei to build critical infrastructure and network backbones because it was cheap, only to later discover that from a security perspective, this created problems because it allowed a potentially hostile great power to be able to obviously commit espionage, but also potentially shut down or allow major aspects of the grid to degrade. European countries, including the UK, are now having to apply security concerns after the electric vehicles have already been let in. And that's likely to, if anything, impose even greater costs and restrictions. So this notion of trying to assess, open the trade and then assess the security risks, I think, is ultimately going to be penny wise and pound foolish, and end up costing more both in dollars and in security.
Great, thank you both very much. And Mr. Kovrig, may I say it's an honor to have you here, and really appreciate your testimony based on very, very real experience that we all acknowledge. So thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Madame Diancho. Okay, Monsieur Natuba, 2 minutes 30.
Mr. Natumba, 2.5 minutes to you, and then 2.5 to your colleague. Thank you, Mr. Chair. My question is for Mr. Turner. In 2026, your organization focused on the modernization and extension of the energy grid. You said that demand in electricity will increase by 112% in the coming years, since EVs are more and more valued. What advice would you give the Government of Canada in the supply chain, the battery supply chain, and how can we confront these issues?
I think the load growth from EVs is significant, and so we work with utilities across the country to grapple with this and understand how quickly it's going to materialize. Fortunately, it happens gradually. Not everybody's going to replace their vehicle overnight. And on top of that, as I mentioned, they're a fundamentally flexible load on the grid. Most people only drive about, say, 50 kilometers a day. Their battery can hold about 400, 500 kilometers of range. So there's a lot of flexibility in terms of when that charging can happen, and do so in a way that there's a lot of benefit to the grid. So given that context and the overall opportunity here in terms of the EV supply chain, I think it's a really important piece of the puzzle to build out these opportunities for vehicle grid integration, and we can serve a dual purpose of supplying Canadians with clean, affordable transportation modes, while also reinforcing the grid with flexible storage assets that can help accommodate the varying supply and demand of electricity.
Madame Sinasak.
Ms. Sinasak, in your introduction, you said that Canada does not have an internationally coordinated forum. Can you explain what you meant by that?
Yes. So right now we don't have a dedicated resource. We need dedicated resources from the federal government to convene industry. So we need utilities, regulators, provincial stakeholders, manufacturers, automakers, everyone to come together. And what we really need to look at is 3 pillars. and they need to happen in parallel. So we need to harmonize the technical frameworks. We need to monetizable business cases, make business cases, and we need to structure pilot and evidence gathering and all three pillars will require funding and national coordination to unlock this opportunity. And similar to the last question that you just asked was, we actually just released a new study here at Electro Federation Canada, and it's called Building Canada's Electricity System. And it's a supply chain and policy roadmap. And how much we need to expand the grid is directly correlated to how successful we are in modernizing the grid. And this includes smart grid technology such as vehicle to grid. And so if we modernize the grid to be more efficient and to utilize and extract more value from the current system that we have, the less grid we need to build. And so this is why this is such urgent work, is because as EVs come online, we need to ensure that we are modernizing the grid. The more modernized our grid is, the less we need to build and less money we need to spend. And right now, the biggest problem is that we can't deploy these technologies at the speed that we need to. And that's really what needs to be done by convening industry at a federal level.
Merci, Monsieur Nutumba. Madame O'Rourke, the floor is yours for 2.5 minutes.
Mr. Chair, Mr. Kovrig, thank you very much for a number of your recommendations, and I think all Canadians are appreciative and thankful that you're here with us today. So thank you for being here. I will direct my questions to Mr. Kingston because I chair the Liberal Auto Caucus, and I'm all about auto and manufacturing. So, Mr. Kingston, you said the JVs are knockdown kits and they bring in Chinese labor, but the minister was really clear that we could set the conditions in Canada for domestic labor, security, and also standards. So I was curious to hear you say that. And wouldn't the limit of 49,000 vehicle prohibit dumping? And it just brings us back to the thresholds from 2023. So in 2023, did you have the same concerns? And then I have a follow-up question for you. So if you could just answer this first one real quick.
Yes. So with respect to the conditions that the minister laid out, my point is that that's not how China operates. So if you say that you have to have a local supply chain and use local unionized labor, the response from a Chinese OEM is thanks, but no thanks. And the CEO of BYD has already said that. So the point is that it's a fantasy that this is even going to happen, because if you want to actually protect the Canadian industry and put in real rules, well, those rules aren't compatible with the Chinese economic model. With respect to dumping, yeah, there's a limit of 49,000, but as I said in my last response, China is a coercive trade partner. The moment they want more access, they will restrict our exports of canola. They'll come up with other reasons to leverage more access into the market. This is the Chinese trade playbook. You can see it in sector after sector in different countries. So it's 49 now, but the door's open.
Okay, and we could cross that bridge when we get to it. While we strengthen our domestic manufacturing, right? I wanted to say also, I'm thrilled to see that GM is the #1 EV seller in Canada this year. I think that's great news. We're really excited to see developments at Ford very shortly. And so we all want to see a strong Canadian manufacturing presence for auto. I'm just wondering, can you help me understand what the joint ventures and partnerships look like for your member companies? We understand global automakers have a number of joint ventures, many of them with Chinese companies. What do they look like for the big three?
Yeah, so the way China works is if you want to access the Chinese market, you have to strike a JV in China. And that's been we've seen this practice in many sectors, aerospace, rail, and of course, automotive. So all of the companies that have sales and operations in China and have built out networks there have had to do through a JV network. So virtually every global OEM has a joint venture in China, and what happens is you do these JVs. China learns from the company that is invested there, and then of course now they're turning around and exporting some of their product around the world. But that is the structure of the Chinese market. You have to have a JV to be in there.
Okay. And then my last one is, I'm wondering your concern around some of the.
Sorry, Madame O'Rourke. I was looking at the calendar, lost track of time, and you almost snuck one past me. Almost snuck one past me. Monsieur Saint-Marie, rapidement.
Mr. Saint-Marie, quickly, please. Mr. Kingston, you represent American companies like GM, Ford, Stellantis, You're pro-free trade, against the tariff. Are American officials making the same arguments against the American government, and are they willing to take legal action against these unjustified tariffs? Thank you.
Question. Absolutely. I mean, the industry has been opposed to U.S. tariff policy. Just to give you a sense of how damaging it's been, manufacturers in the U.S. have already paid $35 billion in tariffs. North American auto production has declined by 2%. Well, production in China is up by 10% last year, and U.S. manufactured vehicles lost market share in Canada, 12% decline in 2025. So U.S. protectionism is doing serious damage to the U.S. industry, and auto manufacturers have been making the case constantly to try and get rid of these tariffs. Obviously, we're not there yet, but the objective is to get back to duty-free North American automotive trade.
Excellent. Merci beaucoup.
Excellent. Thank you very much.
Witnesses that have joined us here today, we very much appreciate you availing yourselves to the committee, and you have the great honor of being the final contributors to the EV study that we've undertaken here, and we look forward as a committee to reviewing all of the testimony that we've received from a variety of different experts over the course of the past number of months, and reporting that back to the House of Commons and by extension to Canadians. So thank you very much for being here with us today. Colleagues, thank you as always for a productive conversation. Look forward to picking up our AI study on Thursday. Meeting adjourned.